Welcome to this, our broadcast of the national ceremony for Anzac Day from the Australian War Memorial. Anzac Day is the day especially when we reflect upon the freedoms that we enjoy as Australians, our political, economic and religious freedoms, and especially those Australian men and women who have made sacrifices to ensure that we are the Australians that we now are. 2 million Australian men and women wear and have worn the uniform of the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Air Force. 102,800 Australians have died in the service of this country. At least 3 times that number have been physically wounded, and an indeterminate number carry their own lived traumas. This day has its origins in the Gallipoli landings, brave young Anzacs forging in bloody sacrifice with New Zealand a bond within which our 2 countries now live. Across land, sea and air, at times Australia's vital interests have been at stake, but always our values. We've been given a legacy, qualities that we see in these Australian men and women, of courage, endurance, of sacrifice and mateship, that spirit that binds us in the face of adversity, of hard times, that we know more than anything else what we need is one another. Throughout our country, in every community, large cities, regions, remoter parts of the country, are cenotaphs, memorials, honour boards, remembrance ways, and a whole variety of things that have been constructed since the First World War as repositories of ennobled memory, of love. For many families, especially after the First World War, they were replacements for graves that they would never ever see. The Australian War Memorial is building a national register of every single one of these memorials, places of pride. We ask you, when you're able to get a photograph, whether you're an individual, community group, some sort of service organisation, just photograph each one of them and upload them onto places of pride. And if you want to, tell us something about them and perhaps what they mean to you. They will eventually be scrolled across a very large electronic screen in the redeveloped, expanded galleries here at the Australian War Memorial. Those places of pride, the Australian War Memorial, this day, Anzac Day, it's not about war. In a context of war, this is all about love and friendship. Love for friends and between friends, love of family, love of our country. Today is the day, especially, we honour men and women whose lives have been devoted not to themselves, but to us, and their last moments to one another. Welcome to our broadcast.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 104th anniversary of the Anzac landing on Gallipoli. My name is Scott Bevan. On behalf of Mr. Kerry Stokes, Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, the Director, the Honourable Dr. Brendan Nelson, along with staff, thank you for joining us this morning. Anzac Day is the day Australians throughout our nation and across the world remember and reflect upon the landing at Gallipoli in 1915 and the spirit of Anzac, with its human qualities of courage, endurance, sacrifice, and mateship. Mateship is the quality that inspires and binds us in the face of adversity. And it continues to bring meaning and relevance to our sense of national character and identity. Anzac Day also honours that moment in which young Australians and New Zealanders forged in bloody sacrifice the bond within which our two nations now live. On this day, we reflect upon and pay tribute to the service of our veterans during ceremonies in cities, in towns, and remote areas across the nation, and in a number of locations overseas. We pause here at the Australian War Memorial for Australia's National Ceremony of Commemoration. The memorial would like to acknowledge the many dignitaries who are joining us on the dais. We also welcome the veterans who have served, those who are still serving, the families who love and support them, the thousands of visitors who have joined us here today, and those watching the televised broadcast. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk commanded the Turkish 19th Division and the Anafarta Group during the Gallipoli campaign of 1915, and he subsequently became the founding president of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. In 1934, President Atatürk delivered a message of reconciliation to visitors from Australia, New Zealand and Great Britain. Vice Admiral Arjumant Tatliolu will now deliver that message, which will be followed by the English translation. Thank you, Admiral.
Vice Admiral Tatlıoğlu, Commander of Turkish Fleet. Bu memleketin toprakları üzerinde kanlarını döken kahramanlar. Burada bir dost vatanın toprağındasınız. Huzur ve sükun içinde uyuyunuz. Sizler Mehmetçiklerle yan yana koyun koyunasınız. Uzak diyarlardan evlatlarını harbe gönderen analar. Gözyaşlarınızı dindiriniz. Evlatlarınız bizim bağrımızdadır. Huzur içindedirler. Ve rahat rahat uyuyacaklardır. Onlar bu toprakta canlarını verdikten sonra artık bizim evlatlarımız olmuşlardır. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives. You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. Thank you.
Atatürk's moving words today inscribed on the Turkish monument at Ari Banu on the northern headland of Anzac Cove have long provided comfort to the bereaved families of those who fell on Gallipoli. In all, more than 130,000 lives were lost during the Gallipoli campaign. service personnel from Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, France, India and Turkey, with many of these soldiers buried alongside one another on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Guard of Honour mounted by the Australian Defence Force Academy and the band of the Royal Military College Duntroon. Today's Guard of Honour is made up of second and third year midshipmen and officer cadets from the Australian Defence Force Academy's Echo Squadron. Echo Squadron won the Academy's Lancaster Shield drill competition in 2018, earning the privilege to provide the Guard on such a significant day. Mr Kerry Stokes, the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, Ms Christine Simpson-Stokes, the Director, the Honourable Dr Brenton Nelson, and Ms Gillian Adamson will now make their way to the saluting dais to await the arrival of the New Zealand High Commissioner, Her Excellency the Honourable Dame Annette King, and Mr Raymond Lind. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the arrival of the New Zealand High Commissioner, Her Excellency the Honourable Dame Annette King, and Mr Raymond Lind. Ladies and gentlemen, arriving in just a moment will be Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham, representing the Prime Minister of Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham, representing the Prime Minister of Australia. Arriving in just a moment, the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, and Her Excellency Lady Cosgrove. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, and Her Excellency Lady Cosgrove. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. On the parade ground in front of the Stone of Remembrance was Wing Commander Jonathan Lilly, a member of the Worimi people of Williamtown, north of Newcastle in New South Wales. Thank you, Wing Commander Lilly, for that performance. Ladies and gentlemen, the Guard of Honour, mounted by the Australian Defence Force Academy and the band of the Royal Military College Duntroon, will now leave the parade ground. Ladies and gentlemen, the Guard on parade today is from the Australian Defence Force Academy, or ADFA. ADFA combines joint military education and training with academic study for an undergraduate degree through the University of New South Wales. Training for midshipmen and officer cadets over the past few weeks has included preparation for today's national ceremony here at the Australian War Memorial. And joining the Guard is the band of the Royal Military College of Duntroon. Since its formation as an official Army unit in 1954, the band of the Royal Military College has been at home on the parade ground and in the concert hall. The band provides musical support to defence establishments in the ACT, including the Corps of Staff Cadets at Duntroon. The band also performs music for all types of ceremonial, social and cultural activities, as well as being the official band for all regal, vice-regal, diplomatic and state functions that are held in the national capital. While we wait for the march to begin, by the end of the First World War, on land, sea and in the air, from a nation of less than 5 million people, 62,000 gave their lives in an Australian uniform. From a nation of just over 1 million people, about 18,000 New Zealanders were killed and more than 40,000 were wounded. In more than a century of service, the Australian and New Zealand Defence Forces have continued to serve together across the world in war and peacekeeping operations. Well, later today, you may wish to visit the memorial's commemorative area where poppies adorn the panels of the memorial's Roll of Honour. These have been placed beside names as a small personal tribute to the memory of a particular person, or in memory of all individuals commemorated there. This practice began at the interment of the unknown Australian soldier on the 11th of November 1993. As people waited to lay a single flower by the tomb in the Hall of Memory, they had to queue along the cloisters beside the Roll of Honour. By the end of that day, hundreds of poppies had been pushed into the cracks between the panels, bearing the names of the fallen. And the heart of the Australian War Memorial is the Hall of Memory. It's a quiet place for contemplation and remembrance of the efforts of ordinary Australians in war. Each one of the hall's 15 stained glass windows represents a defining quality of Australian servicemen and women, incorporating images of Australian soldiers, airmen, sailors and a nurse, all from the First World War. The windows were designed and constructed by Napier Waller, a Victorian artist who lost his right arm on the Western Front. The walls and dome of the hall are lined with one of the largest mosaics in the world. It's also the work of Waller, and it was unveiled in 1959. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please make welcome Royal Australian Navy veteran, Mr. Gerard Pratt, who will lead today's march commentary.
Thank you, Scott, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd first like to invite His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, and Her Excellency the Honourable Dame Annette King, the New Zealand High Commissioner, to make their way to the saluting dais, where they will review today's RSL ACT Branch Veterans March Past. For many decades, the ACT branch of the Returned and Services League of Australia has coordinated and delivered the Veterans March Past. This includes providing the Australian War Memorial with information on who is marching, the order they are marching and how many are marching. We thank RSL ACT branch for their efforts. Today, I will have the privilege of providing you with a brief overview of of the various units and groups as they march onto the parade ground. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2019 Anzac Day RSL ACT Branch Veterans March will now commence. The march traditionally starts with the arrival of the riderless horse, with the saddle stripped and riding boots reversed. This centuries-old tradition at military funerals and memorial ceremonies signifies the return home of the warrior's charger from the battlefield, his empty saddle showing that his master has fallen in battle. The horse today, participating in his 8th Anzac Day ceremony, is a standard-bred gelding named Boy. He is trained as a ride and drive artillery draft horse. Boy is led by an officer depicting Lieutenant Commander Leighton Bracegirdle, the commanding officer of the 1st Royal Australian Naval Bridging Train. This unit was raised in 1915 to be a horse-drawn engineering unit and served with the Royal Naval Division in France. It served instead in the Gallipoli, Sinai and Palestine campaigns and was the last Australian unit to leave Gallipoli. They made 2 amphibious landings, suffered 25 fatalities and were the most highly decorated RAN unit in the First World War. September of this year will mark the 20th anniversary of the deployment to East Timor of the Australian-led 22-nation peacekeeping task force called Interfet, or International Force East Timor. Under the command of then Major General Peter Cosgrove, Interfet had been mandated by the United Nations to address the humanitarian and security crisis which occurred in East Timor following the August 1999 referendum seeking independence from Indonesia. At that time, Interfet was Australia's largest deployment of Navy, Army and Air Force personnel since the Second World War. Interfet handed over operations to the United Nations in February of 2000. A number of Interfet veterans are marching today behind the banners of their respected unit or associations. Coming onto the parade ground now is the parade commander for this morning's march, Mr John King, President of the Returned and Services League of Australia ACT branch, and in the Unity of Anzac. He is accompanied by Air Commodore Ian Mower of the Royal New Zealand Air Force and Mr Ben Robert Smith, Victoria Cross and Medal for Gallantry recipient. They are followed by the flag party, consisting of 4 youngsters drawn from various Canberra youth organisations. They include Scouts, Girl Guides and Boys and Girls Brigade. They're followed by the First World War replica banner, carried today by Warrant Officer Lance Cantor and Corporal Beck Rich of the Royal Australian Air Force. Coming onto the parade ground now is the Officer Training Unit, or OTU Skyville, led by Lieutenant Colonel Les Bogue. This is the first time OTU Skyville has marched at the National Anzac Day ceremony. OTU was established at Skyville in New South Wales in 1965 to increase the numbers of junior officers available to meet the needs of the National Service Scheme. The graduates of Class 4 of 68 have gathered in Canberra from around Australia to celebrate their 50th anniversary. Coming onto the parade ground now is the RSL ACT branch and sub-branches, led by Flying Officer Sean McGill. The Returned and Services League of Australia is one of the oldest ex-service organisations in Australia, evolving out of concern for welfare of returned servicemen from the First World War. As such, the Returned Sailors and Soldiers Imperial League of Australia was formed in 1916. Marking its 92nd anniversary this year, the ACT branch was formed in 1927. On parade today are sub-branches Gungahlin, Belconnen, Campbell Russell, Tuggeranong, Peacekeepers, Woden Valley, Hellenic and Vietnamese. They're joined by the Queensland branch of Bribie Island sub-branch, along with students from 3 schools located on the island. You'll note the distinctive UN blue beret worn by those members of the Peacekeepers sub-branch. Peacekeepers first deployed on operations to Indonesia in 1947, and since then more than 30,000 Australians have taken part in hazardous peacekeeping or disaster relief operations. They're followed by the Hellenic and Vietnamese sub-branches, joined by community representatives marching in traditional dress. The Bribie Island contingent are here as part of the sub-branch's Community Link program, and this is their 24th year. Coming onto the parade ground now are Land Rovers and a Second World War Willys Jeep, carrying our less mobile veterans. One of those is Second World War Royal Australian Air Force veteran, 93-year-old Gordon Green. Gordon joined the Royal Australian Air Force in 1944, aged just 17, and served on New Guinea and Borneo. Please give Gordon and those veterans a very warm welcome. September this year will mark the 80th anniversary of the start of the Second World War. Almost 1 million Australians would serve during this war, and sadly 40,000 would pay the ultimate sacrifice. Our next contingent is the New Zealand contingent. This includes veterans from the ACT and surrounding areas. Members in the group are currently serving at the High Commission with the Department of Defence or undergoing training at various Defence Service colleges. They're followed by our Second World War Royal Australian Navy. During the Second World War, Australian sailors and ships served in theatres from the tropical Pacific to the North Atlantic convoys. As a result, they took part in every major naval battle. Our next contingent is the Australian Army. Second World War. During the Second World War, the Army fought in North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Malaya, Singapore, and much closer to home in New Guinea, the surrounding islands and Australia. The next contingent is the Rats of Tobruk. In 1941, an 8-month siege of the critical North African port of Tobruk by German General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps commenced. The defenders, who were mainly Australian, lived a harsh existence that led to the Germans calling them rats, a name they adopted with pride, so that to be a rat of Tobruk became a badge of honour. Our next contingent is the Second World War Royal Australian Air Force. And I know there are a number of Second World War veterans in this group, hence you can forgive them for being a little slow on the step. They're led today by Mr. Ray Walker, one of the memorial's many volunteers, and Ray is accompanied by the Royal Australian Air Force Officer Cadets of Lancaster Group of the Australian Defence Force Academy, who are now custodians of the 467-463 Squadron banner. During the Second World War, 215,000 men and women served in the Royal Australian Air Force and almost 10,000 lost their lives. The RAF served with distinction over the Pacific, Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the Mediterranean, in Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, Burma, India, New Guinea and Asia. Australians served in more than 200 RAF squadrons across bomber, fighter and coastal commands and in training and transport units. Our next contingent is the ex-service women's contingent led by Mrs Margaret Flett. Across the centuries, women have been involved in every conflict Australia has been part of. Ladies marching today are from the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service, the Australian Women's Army Service, the Women's Royal Australian Army Corps and the Women's Royal Australian Air Force. The next contingent there is the National Servicemen's Association. This contingent consists of representatives from two national service schemes instituted following the Second World War. The next contingent are our Korean War veterans. All three Australian services fought as part of the United Nations coalition that defended South Korea from North Korea and China between June 1950 and July 1953. They are followed by the National Malaya and Borneo Veterans Association. Led by Mr Ian Davenport, the association membership is comprised of veterans of the Malayan Emergency and the Indonesian Confrontation. Our next contingent are our Vietnam Veterans Federation, led by Commander Ward Gainey. This contingent comprises veterans of the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Army, the Royal Australian Air Force, who served in South Vietnam during 1962 to 1973. Approximately 60,000 Australian men and women would serve in Vietnam. Coming onto the parade ground now is the HMAS Sydney Escorts and Vietnam Logistics Support Veterans Association. The ACT branch and association was formed in 1992, 120 members strong. The crew members served mainly during the 25 logistics support trips to Vung Tau in Vietnam between 1965 and 72 by HMAS Sydney. Hence her affectionate name, the Vung Tau Ferry. Next is my association, HMAS Perth, led by Mr Jack Aaron, another of the Memorial's volunteers. The HMAS Perth Association consists of former and serving officers and sailors who served in any of the three Perths. The first, sunk during the Second World War in the Battle of the Sunda Strait, the second, who served 3 tours of Vietnam, and the third, commissioned in 2006, deployed to the Middle East in 2016. They're followed by the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, simply known as the Team. Nearly 1,000 men would serve in this unit during the Vietnam War, continuously training, advising, leading and their Vietnamese counterparts. The next contingent is Detachment 131 Divisional Locating Battery. Those men served in Vietnam between 68 and 69, with the majority being national servicemen. Next is No. 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. Formed in 1939 at RAF Base Richmond as Australia's only fleet cooperation squadron. They operated Seagull and Walrus amphibious aircraft during the Second World War. In 1962, they were equipped with Iroquois helicopters and from 1966, for 5.5 years, deployed to Vietnam. They were the most highly decorated squadron during the Vietnam War. They're followed by our Airfield Defence Guards. These guards have defended airfields from the Second World War through to Vietnam, served prominently in East Timor and roles in the Middle East. Our next contingent is Somalia. Between 1992 and 93, Australian troops deployed to Somalia with UN personnel from 20 other countries. Their role was to monitor a ceasefire. That's followed by our Rwandan contingent, led today by Lieutenant General John Fruin. This contingent consists of the UN Assistance Mission for Rwanda, Australian contingents 1 and 2, including Air Vice Marshal Tracy Smart and Warrant Officer Class 2 Jason Rugleweski-Slade. They're followed by the East Timor contingent, comprising of veterans who served in East Timor between September 1999 and December 2012. The next contingent is our Afghanistan contingent. Australians have served in Afghanistan from 2001 and approximately 300 troops are still there. Our next contingent is HMAS Stewart. This contingent first deployed in 2004, led today by Commodore Philip Spedding and Commodore Michelle Miller, who were the commanding officer and executive officer respective at the time. They march in honour of the 3 US sailors killed during their deployment in USS Firebolt. They're followed by the Naval Association of Australia, formed in 1920, originally called the Ex-Nablemen's Association. In 1922, they amalgamated with the China Naval Contingent, making them one of the oldest associations of its kind. Behind them is the Naval Warfare Officers Association, led by Captain Simon Wooldrick. This association maintains close links with the Royal Australian Navy and includes retired and serving officers of all specialisations who have commanded or have served on operations at sea since the Second World War. Behind them is the Fleet Air Arm Association of Australia. Following the Second World War, the importance of seaborne air power was recognised, and in 1948 the Fleet Air Arm was born at HMAS Albatross. It also saw the purchase of aircraft carriers Sydney and Melbourne. Behind them is the Submarines Association of Australia, led by Captain Ian Noble. Formed in 1980, they comprise of current and former submariners from all countries. Next is another of my associations, the Royal Australian Navy Communications Branch, led by Paul McCoy. Formed after the Second World War, these communicators look after satellite, radio, flashing light and flags, also the ship's IT systems. They are the eyes and ears of the fleet. Behind them is the RANS, the Women's Royal Naval Service, and the Women's Royal Australian Navy Service, in which ladies have served. This association unites and develops comradeship, fosters fellowship, social contact and support. Following contingent is the Tingara Australian Association. This association keeps the spirit of Cerberus and Lewin junior recruits alive through the reuniting of class and shipmates. 13,000 junior recruits aged between 15 and 16 undertook this training between 1960 and 1984. The next contingent is the Royal Australian Armoured Corps Association. This corps heritage embraces Australia's light horse, cavalry, tank, armoured reconnaissance and personnel carrier regiments. The corps heritage stretches back to the colonial era, with light horse and mounted infantry serving in the Boer War. They're followed by the 1st Armoured Regiment Association. Formed as a light tank unit in the newly created Australian Regular Army in 1949, the regiment subsequently saw service during the Vietnam War. The next contingent is the Survey Corps, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Bullen. The Royal Australian Survey Corps was formed in 1915 and served as an independent corps until integrated into the Royal Australian Engineers in 1996 and then into the Australian Intelligence Corps in 2018. Making their way onto the program now is the Royal Australian Corps of Signals Association, led by Major General Ian Gordon, the association patron. The Corps of Signals provides the Australian Army with radio, telephone and data communications both at home and when deployed overseas. Making their way onto the program now is the Royal Australian Regiment Association, led by Michael Cole, ACT Branch Vice President. The Royal Australian Regiment is the professional infantry regiment of the Australian Army. The regiment has distinction in the Korean War, the Malayan Emergency, confrontation in Malaya and Borneo, the Vietnam War, the intervention in East Timor, the First and Second Gulf Wars against Iraq, the war in Afghanistan and current support to Iraqi forces. Moving on to the program now is the Australian Special Air Service Association, led by Mr Dan Fortune. This contingent represents current and former members of the Special Air Service Regiment and invited veterans from selected Foreign Special Force units. They're followed by the Commando Association, led by Mr Bruce Parr. This association represents all past and present members of Commando units, including the independent companies and Z special units of the Second World War. Coming on to the program now is the Australian Intelligence Corps. This corps served in most theatres of war to this day, often working in small detachments to provide timely and accurate information to command, ensuring the impact of conflict on our own forces is greatly reduced. Next contingent is the Army Aviation. Army Aviation has traditional links with the Australian Flying Corps, the Royal Regiment of Australian Artillery and the Royal Australian Air Force. Formed in 1950, they have served in most theatres since that time. Behind them is the Royal Australian Corps of Transport, formed in 1973 when the road transport, amphibious transport, air dispatch and postal functions of the Royal Australian Service Corps were amalgamated. The Corps' motto, Par Honorae, means equal to the task. They're followed by the Royal Australian Army Medical Corps Association, led by Brigadier Georgina Wellham, formed in 1903 to provide a medical service wherever Australian Army commitments have been made. They're followed by Australian Defence Force Nursing, led by Lieutenant Colonel Kim Sullivan. This contingent is made up of current serving Navy, Army and Air Force. Serving since 1898, Defence nurses have played a significant role in the treatment of our troops. They're followed by the Dental Corps, formed in 1943 when they separated from the Medical Corps. The next contingent is the Royal Australian Army Ordnance Corps, formed in 1902. Since that time, personnel from this corps have provided the Army's supply, support and personnel services that are essential to sustain every mission. The next contingent is the Royal Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers Association. This corps was established in 1942 and given the prefix Royal in 1948, responsible for the provision of technical advice and for the repair of a vast array of equipment the Army operates. Next contingent is the Military Police Association, led by Colonel Nick Surtees, Provost Marshal of the Australian Defence Force. The Royal Australian Corps of Military Police was formed in 1916 and has served in every conflict. A national association was formed in 2004 with a membership of about 500. We now move into the Werriwa District Army Reserves, led by Major Bill Stefaniak, former Leader of the Opposition of the ACT Legislative Assembly. The bulk of this contingent comprised of former members of the 3rd Battalion, the Royal New South Wales Regiment, successor to the 3rd Infantry Battalion. They're followed by the Wanderers Association, the National Servicemen's Association. Coming on the program now is the Multinational Force and Observers. As with UN peacekeepers, they have their distinct beret, this time orange. The Multinational Force and Observers are responsible for peacekeeping in the Sinai, a role Australia has undertaken since 1981. Next is the Royal Australian Air Force Association, led by Judy Webster, formed in 1921 with a Canberra branch established in 1946. Some of our larger contingents now. Coming onto the program is the Australian Army Headquarters contingent, made up of all ranks, consisting of senior officers down to private soldiers. This contingent is marching behind the banner party, who is escorting the Army Banner 2019. This banner was formally presented to Army at a ceremony held here in the Australian War Memorial in March. Australian soldiers are currently deployed all around the world on a number of UN missions. Our next contingent is the Royal Australian Air Force contingent, led by Air Commodore Phil Champion, made up of units from across the Canberra region. Many have served in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East, on peacekeeping missions such as East Timor and the Multinational Force and Observers in the Sinai. Military aviation was first pioneered during the First World War. During that war, both the armies and navies of all the major combatants operated aircraft. Later in the war, they realised that aerial fighting was a distinct form of warfare and not just an adjunct to land or sea operations. The Royal Australian Air Force distinguished itself in the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam and East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan. Coming onto the program now is number 460 Squadron. Formed as a heavy bomber squadron in 1941 during the Second World War. By war's end, they had lost 188 aircraft and more than 1,000 airmen. Disbanded in 1945, reformed in July 2010 as the RAAF's Target Intelligence Squadron. Coming onto the program now is the Australian Red Cross, led by Mark Duggan. The Australian Red Cross has a proud history of supporting Australian military personnel during wartime. During the First World War, the Australian Red Cross raised almost £5 million for the war effort. Our next contingent is our international contingent from India. This contingent includes veterans from the ACT and surrounding areas, currently serving at the High Commission with the Department of Defence or undergoing training at various Australian service colleges. The next one is the Australian Turkish community. Australian Turkish veterans and relatives of those who served in the Gallipoli campaign in 1915 are marching today. They emphasise the close ties between Australia and Turkey. The Gallipoli campaign would cost 8,709 Australian, 2,721 New Zealand and 86,700 Turkish lives. Moving on to the parade ground now is the United States Armed Forces. This contingent consists of serving Americans posted to Canberra in various capacities, as well as retired and former military veterans now living in Australia. They march in recognition of the strong ties held between our two nations. The United States contingent is followed by the Australian Army Unit's 224 Army Cadet Unit. Celebrating their 25th birthday this year, 224 Regional Army Cadet Unit operates from the multi-user depot at HMAS Harmon. Cadets range in age from 13 to 18 years of age. 224 ACU is one of the largest community-based Australian cadet units in Australia, with more than 150 cadets and staff. They're joined today by cadets from across New Zealand. These cadets attended the 8-day Australian Army Cadet Adventure Training Award activity last week. This was attended by 200 cadets from Australia and New Zealand. Also joining the Army Cadets is then the newest cadet unit of Canberra, 241 Army Cadet Unit, only forming in February of this year. They also currently parade at Harmon, however the unit hopes to soon relocate to North Canberra. The senior cadet for 241 ACU is Cadet Warrant Officer Class 2, Joss Fletcher, who was the Student of Merit at January's promotion courses. Moving on to the parade ground now is the first of our Australian Air Force Cadet Squadrons, number 315, number 315. 315 has enjoyed a long and successful history in Canberra, providing the youth with a number of skills. 315 Squadron will celebrate its 68th anniversary in August of this year. They parade at HMAS Harmon along with 140 cadets within their ranks. It also includes number 327 Squadron, the newest Australian Air Force Cadet Squadron, only formed in February. They parade each week in Gungahlin. They're followed by number 334 Squadron, Australian Air Force Cadets, the third of the ACT's cadet squadrons. Formed in 1992, the squadron currently has 80 cadets between the ages of 12 and 18. They're followed Moving on to the parade ground now, members of Australia's Federation Guard who have assisted with the RSL today, acting as marshals. They're followed by the Canberra City Band, Australia's oldest and most prestigious concert band. Formed in 1925, they provided much of the work required by Parliament in the early years from 1925. The next contingent is the Burns Club's Pipes and Drums, formed in 1937 to promote a bit of Scottish culture in the Canberra community. Next is Legacy. Today's march is the first occasion where widows and dependents of our veterans have formally taken their place in the march. Of special importance is the fact that those present today represent veterans who have served in theatres from the Second World War to current conflicts in Afghanistan. Today's flag bearers are legatee Rebecca Ryan and Ronan Gotch. One of the widows marching today is Jean Mackay. Her late husband Peter served in the army on Thursday Island in the Second World War. Her father Thomas served in the First World War. Her brother Tommy served in the army in the Middle East and New Guinea in the Second World War. Two of her sisters also served in the Second World War. Kathy, a signaller in the Air Force, and Molly, a lieutenant in the Army, and her son Peter was a Nasho and served in Vietnam. Anzac Day is always a special day. They're followed by our representatives and relatives of all wars. Having first marched in 2017, this contingent consists of relatives of servicemen and women who have served in our Navy or Army or Air Force. Now, I know they've already moved through, but ladies and gentlemen, please keep clapping. A big round of applause to our parade marshals. They've ensured the 70-odd contingents who marched this morning stepped off in the correct order, mostly, and mostly on the right foot. Also, may I also acknowledge the many veterans who didn't march, but have still joined us for today's ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, please keep the applause going to thank the Scouts, the Girl Guides and the Boys and Girl Brigade members who assisted today by carrying the name boards in front of each of the marching contingents. Trust me when I say, it makes my job up here so much easier. Could you also please show your appreciation to the band of the Royal Military College Duntroon, led by Major Darren Cole, for their magnificent contribution to this morning's march past. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great privilege to once again provide today's RSL ACT Branch Veterans March commentary for this, the 104th anniversary of the Anzac landing at Gallipoli. I'm sure you'll all agree it was a wonderful march. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, thank you for reviewing the march past this morning. And Gerard, thank you for your informative commentary. Ladies and gentlemen, as we await the return of the Guard of Honour, at the end of each day, the memorial closes its doors and farewells visitors with its last post ceremony. And conducted in the commemorative area, the ceremony features a reading about one of the servicemen and women whose names are listed on the Roll of Honour. Now, this moving ceremony offers visitors an opportunity to reflect on the sacrifices made by Australians in all wars, in all conflicts. And today's ceremony will honour Sergeant Charles Backman. He was killed on this day 104 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, the Guard of Honour, mounted by the Australian Defence Force Academy and the Band of the Royal Military College Duntroon, will now return to the parade ground. The catafalque party will now be mounted at the Stone of Remembrance. Ladies and gentlemen, this year the commemorative address will be delivered by the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove.
For some here attending this moment in the national capital, and others like this elsewhere around the nation, this will be your first Anzac Day service. Some of you are youngsters, some are new to this nation. For all of those newly come to this national ritual, we expect that you will all be eager to understand what it is that draws us as a nation together so solemnly more than 100 years after an event in a war so very far from our shores. On this day, 100 years ago, the Great War had been over for about 5 months. This great memorial campus here in Canberra had not yet been created, but all over Australia, in communities great and small, people gathered to rejoice the deliverance of the remnants of the flower of our youth from history's most terrible war. Equally so, probably more so, those gatherings mourned the dreadful loss of life in faraway places, the loss of innocence in hearth and home. In a nation of 5 million or so, around 420,000 of our men and women served in uniform in World War I. When the guns drew silent in November 1918, there were 95,000 Australians in France and another 60,000 in Great Britain. In the Middle East, there were another 30,000. Of course, I've not included the more than 60,000 lying in graves or whose remains lay unrecovered on the battlefield. Still, it was over. The war to end all wars had drawn to a close, and nations could now argue about the peace. Our men and women could come home. Imagine the excitement when the first contingent arrived back in Australia on the 3rd of December 1918. But the process must have seemed agonisingly slow to both the troops and, of course, their loved ones. The final troop convoy didn't arrive in Fremantle until late September 1919. While the fighting had stopped, before the AIF was eventually disbanded, another 2,200 of those men and women succumbed to wounds, illnesses and accidents. The grief of those families back in Australia is unimaginable. Every family in Australia that suffered a loss or received home a family member ruined by their war experience must have asked, why did they go? What was it for? Was it worth it? These questions were always justified then, and they're justified now. The Australia of 1914 was bursting with energy and optimism and innocence and the exuberance of liberty. Although we had the most profound historical, cultural and even legal ties to the mother country, Great Britain, nonetheless, there was a sense here of growing independence and of precious democratic freedoms. Setting aside the rising jingoism associated with threatening events in Europe, there was a natural foreboding in Australia that our peaceful future was inextricably linked to the balance of power over there. The growing threat of hegemonism invoked deep unease within Australians, from our national leadership to ordinary families. Of course, there was a veneer of naivety. There always is with the complex motivations of nations contemplating war. But afterward, those bereaved families, those shattered individuals returning to their homeland Australia, did cling to the notion that Australia stood up for what was right, even when the cost was awful. Let it be always thus. So for those who wonder why communities assemble on this day every year at dawn and later in the morning, as Governor-General I say that in the gamut of motives, from the profoundly philosophical to simple curiosity, there is a fundamental reason. It is by our presence to say to the shades of those countless men and women who did not come home, or who made it back but who have now passed, and to say to their modern representatives, the ones around the nation who today march behind their banners, you matter. What you did matters. You are in our hearts. Let it be always thus. And now perhaps an insight as to why we veterans gather and march proudly behind those banners in our ranks of old. For the camaraderie, of course, and to honour those who faded from our ranks, gone but not forgotten, while there's a breath in any of us. But also because it symbolises for each of us that part of our lives which was once characterised by service before self. When we put aside personal safety and the comfort of hearth and home for the needs of our duty. You know, when we march, we like to look at those gathered to watch and wonder, young and old, family, friends and strangers, and to catch their gaze and convey our silent message. We did it for our nation, for what Australia stands for. We did it for you. Let it be always thus.
Your Excellency, thank you for those remarkable words. And the Memorial staff and Council would also like to express their gratitude to you for your unwavering support of the Memorial and wish you and Lady Cosgrove well for your upcoming retirement. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand for the hymn, O Valiant Hearts?
O valiant hearts, who to your glory came, through dust of conflict and through battle. Your knightly virtue proved, your memory hallowed in the land you loved. Proudly you gathered rank on rank to war, as who had heard God's message from afar. All you had hoped for, all you had, you gave to save mankind. Yourselves you scorned to save. Splendid you passed the great surrender made into the light that never more shall fade. Deep your contentment in that blessed abode, who waits the last clear trumpet call of God.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Wreaths will now be laid in the following order. The Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove and Her Excellency Lady Cosgrove. Representing the Prime Minister of Australia, Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham, and the New Zealand High Commissioner, Her Excellency the Honourable Dame Annette King. These wreaths are laid together in memory of the significance of Anzac to Australians and New Zealanders. Representing the Chief Minister of the Australian Capital Territory, Mr Gordon Ramsay. Representing the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mr James Catchpole, and representing the President of the Senate, Senator Zed Seselja. The Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia, the Honourable Chief Justice Susan Kiefel. The Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, His Excellency Mr Abel Guterres. the British High Commissioner, Her Excellency Mrs. Victoria Treadle, and the Turkish Ambassador, His Excellency Mr. Korhan Karakoç. Representing the Leader of the Federal Opposition, the Honourable Dr. Andrew Leigh. Representing the Chief of the Defence Force, Vice Admiral David Johnston. Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, Mr. Kerry Stokes. And representing the National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, Mr. John King. Representing the Chief of Navy, Rear Admiral Mark Hammond. Representing the Chief of Army, Major General Anthony Rawlins. And representing the Chief of Air Force, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Turnbull. National President of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Veterans and Services Association, Squadron Leader Gary Oakley, and accompanying the National President is Wing Commander Jonathan Lilly, today's didgeridoo player. Representing the National President of the Naval Association of Australia, Commander Peter Launder, and National President of the Air Force Association, Group Captain Carl Schiller. National President of the War Widows Guild of Australia, Mrs. Meg Green, and National President of the Australian Federation of Totally and Permanently Incapacitated Ex-Servicemen and Women, Ms. Pat McCabe. And the final wreaths will be laid by the Chairman of Legacy Australia, Legatee Richard Cranner, accompanied by junior legatees, Kathleen Gibson and Tyree Kovco. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the reading of the Creed by the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, Mr. Kerry Stokes.
On the morning of the 25th of April 1915, Australians and New Zealanders landed under fire on Gallipoli. It was then, and in the battlefields which followed, that Anzac tradition was formed and the bond in which Australia and New Zealand now live was forged. Today, above all days, we remember those who served our nation in times of peace and in times of peace. We remember with pride their courage, compassion and comradeship. We remember what they accomplished for Australia and indeed for freedom and of mankind. We honour those who died or were disabled in the tragedy of war. Their stories adorn our nation's history. We grieve for the families of the fallen, particularly the war widows and the orphans. We recall with pride the selfless service of Australian men and women in places near and far, on battlefields in many lands, honour under the oceans, seas, waterways, and in the skies over many theatres of war and other operations. We remember those who have suffered as prisoners of war and those who died in captivity. We remember staunch friends and allies. Those who have served our nation have bequeathed to us a great legacy. May we and the generations to come prove worthy of their sacrifice.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing while we join together in the singing of the hymn, Abide With Me.
Abide with me, fast falls the eventide, earth's joys grow dim, its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes. Shine through the gloom and point me to the skies. Hemmed morning breaks and earth's vain shadows flee. In life, in death, O Lord, abide with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing as the representative for the National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, Mr. John King, recites the ode. After the ode, the last post will be sounded, followed by a minute's silence and the rouse.
They shall not grow old, as we to the left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. lest we forget.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. This morning, our commemoration started with a reflection of the Anzac experiences on Gallipoli 104 years ago. We now consider more recent times and the experiences of soldiers in Uruzgan province in Afghanistan through Sapper's Lullaby, a song written by Mr. Fred Smith. Well, the constant threat of improvised explosive devices meant that our soldiers in Afghanistan travelled with sappers, or combat engineers. Now, these brave young soldiers were often out in front, with their mine detectors and their dogs. Working at the front of the patrols, sappers would look for bombs hidden beneath the road surface or concealed along the side of tracks. Carrying 60 kilograms of body armour and equipment, often in up to 45-degree heat, they would toil for hours at a time, covering only 2 or 3 metres a minute, knowing any mistake could spell disaster for themselves or their mates in the patrol behind them. 7 Australian sappers were killed in southern Afghanistan, including 2 on the 7th of June 2010. Sappers Darren Smith and Jacob Morland. Darren's beloved explosive detection dog, Herbie, was also killed in the incident that day. And their photo, currently on the screens before you, was taken just days before that incident. Fred Smith was serving in Afghanistan at the time as an officer for the Department of Foreign Affairs. Well, after attending the ramp ceremony to farewell the casket's home, he wrote a song that he will now perform. He first performed it at Poppies, the recreation centre at the Australian base in Tarancot. Ladies and gentlemen, Fred's tribute to these brave young engineers, Sapper's Lullaby.
Up from the roll to and down past the gate, out to the flight line. We stood in the sun, slouch hat and gun, as 2 caskets passed us by, and followed the Padre onto the Herc and out into the pale summer sky. We walked back to Poppies, then went back to work with the dust still in our eyes. So soldiers, sing me your sapper's lullaby. You give it your all, known if you should fall, that all good things must die. These young engineers, whose job is to clear the roads so we may pass, they're always out front, and when they bear the brunt, Man, it happens fast. Sapper D. Smith had a wife and a son, the apple of his eye. Snowy Moreland was just 21, way too young to die. So soldiers, sing me your sapper's lullaby. You give it your all, knowing if you should fall, that all good things must die. So go call your mother, call your old man on that welfare line, and tell him you love him while you still can, 'cause all good things must die. Soldiers, sing me your sapper's lullaby. You give it your all, knowing if you should fall, that all good things must die. All good things must die.
Fred, thank you. Such a poignant tribute to our young servicemen and women, and a reminder of the grim realities of war. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Fred Smith and his musicians once more. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please stand and join in the singing as the band of the Royal Military College Duntroon leads us in the National Anthem of New Zealand and the National Anthem of Australia.
Tava Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is good by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gift of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Beneath our radiant Southern Cross, we'll toil with hearts and hands to make this commonwealth of ours renowned of all the lands. For those who've come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. With courage let us all combine to advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a few moments we'll have the pleasure of witnessing right above us a Royal Australian Air Force formation fly-past consisting of 3 Hawk 127 fighters. Now please be advised, these aircraft are rather loud. They're on their way now, and these aircraft are operated by number 76 Squadron at RAAF base Williamtown near Newcastle. And 76 Squadron is a Royal Australian Air Force flight training squadron. And here they are. Ladies and gentlemen, the catafalque party will now dismount from the Stone of Remembrance. The Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, will now move to the saluting dais, where he will receive a royal salute to mark his departure. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. This year, His Excellency General the Honourable Sir Peter Cosgrove, Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham, Her Excellency the Honourable Dame Annette King, the Honourable Dr Andrew Lee, Vice Admiral David Johnston, Mr Kerry Stokes, the Honourable Dr Brendan Nelson, and their guests will make their way into the Hall of Memory to lay floral tributes at the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. The floral tributes include small wooden crosses written on by Australian school children with messages of hope and of thanks for those who have served in Australia's name. These crosses are also being placed on the graves of Australian service personnel around the globe. The Guard of Honour, mounted by the Australian Defence Force Academy and the band of the Royal Military College Duntroon, will now march off the parade ground. Ladies and gentlemen, the Guard of Honour, mounted by the Australian Defence Force Academy and the bands of the Royal Military College Duntroon. Anyone who wishes to lay a wreath or floral tribute at the Stone of Remembrance may do so at the end of the ceremony. The memorial's commemorative area will open in approximately 20 minutes and the galleries will open soon after that. In the meantime, you may wish to visit Poppy's Cafe behind me on the eastern side of the grounds. And today at 4:55, the last post-ceremony in the commemorative area will conclude the memorial's Anzac Day commemorations, and you are most welcome to attend. The last post-ceremony is also streamed live on the memorial's YouTube channel and Facebook page. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the 2019 Anzac Day National Ceremony at the Australian War Memorial.